LCD and television broadcasts 24/7 on UK Freeview Channel 271, Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, Android TV, Apple TV, Google TV, See Love World, LCDandTV.com, LifeComTV.com.
Good evening, and welcome to another conversation with Lydia. My name is Lydia Khalil, and today we're going to be talking about organizations, how they are. We know organizations are made up of people, and this creates an atmosphere. So we've got a lady who's going to talk about the power dynamics in the workplace. Does racism exist? How it exists, and how that power is played out between races. So please welcome me. Help me welcome Joanna Traynor.
Hi.
Hi, welcome Joanna. Thank you for joining me this evening. I'm a little tongue-tied today. To be honest, I'm tired. I've been doing a lot of traveling. But that's enough about me. Please tell us a little bit about yourself. I didn't want to sort of read out the bio, which I could have done.
Okay, so, well, I am an organisational consultant. So myself and my partner, we have an organisation called Sensia, and we help organisations to understand the power dynamics that are operating at play. But that's one hat. My other hat is as a psychotherapist. And so I help people who have got personal problems, anxiety, depression, or all the things that we go to therapy for. So, and a lot of the skills that I use in psychotherapy, I use in organisations with people. So, with people in organisations. So, and the organisation itself can often behave like a person. So, an organisation is lots of people working together, but it often has a mind of its own as well. So that's quite interesting to analyse and see how it's playing out.
Yeah, because I think most of the time we feel an organisation is just a building, it's a structure. But what you're saying is that actually there's more to that structure or that name that we see. There is something behind that carries the organization along. Okay, so before we get into that, how does a nurse transcend into this path? Because you started off as a nurse.
Well, that's an interesting story in itself. So I grew up in the northwest of England, and I was actually I grew up in care. And at the end of the care, when I was 18 years old, they didn't know what to do with me because I'd left school. I didn't want to go to school at 16. So the grown-ups forced me to go to school at 16. And at 18, I just refused point blank to do any more education. And I didn't want to go to university, but they didn't know what to do with me because I didn't have a family. So they found me a job as a nurse, because a nurse also has a home. They have nurses' homes for nurses, or used to in those days. And so it was kill two birds with one stone, give her a job as a nurse and she'll have a job and a home to go to. So I spent 2 years being a nurse, realizing during that time, because it's very hard work being a nurse, that actually maybe education wasn't such a bad idea after all. Wouldn't it be better to be with friends at a university and going out dancing every night and lying in bed late in the mornings, not going to lectures, rather than being a student nurse? So that's exactly what I did. And I was very interested in how the mind works and how people behave towards each other, even at that early age, and went off to do a psychology degree in the early 80s, which was long before psychology was actually a thing, if you will. And in fact, when I started studying psychology, it was a Bachelor of Arts degree. But before the 3 years were over, it had been converted into a Bachelor of Science degree because a lot of the content and syllabus was statistical, i.e. evidence-based psychology interventions. You needed to use a lot of stats in order to provide this evidence. And so it was converted into a science degree. So my interest in psychology started at that point, really. So, yeah.
Okay, so not a bad switch. So it worked out being sort of given a career path. But I think earlier on you sort of relied on your instincts and went towards psychology, and that has taken you to what you do now.
Well, in a way, because of course those were early days for psychology, and there wasn't a lot of, these degrees, sociology, psychology, they were kind of looked down on by the establishment, if you will, who much preferred maths and physics and, proper science. Behavioral sciences hadn't really struck gold by that time. So after I finished my degree, I set off for London, and nobody wanted a girl with a psychology degree, I can tell you that much. And so I ended up getting work in commerce. Well, actually, I worked for the Guardian newspaper in London for a short while, and I worked for the Royal College of Nursing, and I just didn't like any of these jobs. And I ended up working I was a technologist, so I used to work for the Apple UK subsidiaries in Apple centres in the southwest of England. So I spent a long time of my career, well, a good 15 years working in technology. But one of the things that I discovered whilst working in technology is that it was much better to type my writing. I've always been a keen storyteller, a keen writer. But whenever I wrote stories by hand, I couldn't read them afterwards because I've got terrible handwriting. So with computers, this allowed me to write and edit and rewrite, and I could always read my writing and get better and better. So I was able to, after a few years in IT, I entered a Black British literature competition, which was being run by Marsha Hunt. Marsha Hunt being the author of Joy and Hair, the Afro Hair, Marsha Hunt. She launched this literary prize for Black British authors because her mixed daughter, in fact Mick Jagger's daughter, couldn't find any books that had characters that looked like her. And so this literary prize meant that if whoever won it would get their book published and win a few £1,000s. And so I entered this competition and won it. So my first novel was published by Bloomsbury, and then I published a few more novels after that, a couple more novels after that, and then from that became a TV producer. So now we're looking at psychology and story and the development of understanding of narrative and how narrative forms the basis of our lives. And when you work in TV production, of course, it's all about story. Everybody wants a story. If you're not telling a decent story, everyone turns over and finds another story that's better. So story has been very much a big part of my life. Yeah.
Okay, and there's something I think in your little bio that you sent us, which is I'm sure much bigger, is that there is power embedded in the narrative, and I think when clients come to us, most of the time they're trying to change the narrative they have of themselves, what their self-belief is, or what somebody has allowed them to think that they are, or something that has happened to them that has now changed the narrative or the trajectory of their life. So it's actually quite powerful. I don't think that the way we see life, feel life, express ourselves is all in that narrative that we were given, so that it actually has a lot of power. So when somebody sits in front of us, a therapist or a good therapist anyway, most of the time they're trying to change a narrative that it's impacting them in a wrong way. So can you sort of maybe give us an example of that, so that people who are not therapists get what we're talking about?
Well, I think the thing about the human condition, I suppose, humans make sense of the world through telling stories. So if we go right back to the caveman, he painted a picture of a lion on the cave wall so that his son could know exactly who it was that killed his granddad. He says, look, here's the lion. If you see anything like that while you're out there hunting, you need to leg it because this is what killed granddad. That's a story. So the picture is a story. Pictures tell stories. We tell stories with words. We tell stories with art. We originally told stories with pictures to make sense of the world, to pass messages on. Now, why are we wanting to make sense of the world? Well, we, like all mammals, need to protect our young. We are protecting the species. The species won't survive if the young don't survive. So we need to allow the young to understand how the world works. And so the best way of telling them is to tell them a story. If you give them a list of things to remember, you know what you do. If you give a list to a child, he's going to rip it up and throw it in the bin and then go and play. So, and the play is often a reenactment of a story. So our brains are much more readily prepared for stories than they are for facts, for lists, for learning things that are unconnected. So story connects one thing to another. Now, if we watch a film and the character that we love the most dies, then tears might come to our eyes. The part of the brain that's processing that story is not really aware and doesn't care that the story has been constructed in Hollywood, that there are 8 cameramen filming the dying person in the center of the stage. We don't take in it that the part of the brain that processes story doesn't take in context. So it takes in the emotional data points of the story. It takes in what the emotional meaning of the story is. So if we tell ourselves stories and if we tell other people stories, it doesn't matter that some of the context, and this is what newspapers do, they'll plaster a story in the newspaper and you think, oh my God, that's not allowed, you can't do that, that's terrible. And then somebody will then put a bit of context around it and you go, oh right, oh well, that paints a different picture, doesn't it? A bit more information, we get a different picture. So, but first of all, that's too late. We've already reacted to the story, so we already have a belief that original story is true, and that's how we are about each other. That's how we are in the workplace. So we say in the workplace, whoever tells the best story wins, because story beats fact, hands down. The power of story beats fact, hands down. And nobody knew that better than Donald Trump. Nobody knows this better than the politicians. Nobody knows this better than religious leaders. That's why the Bible is full of stories. That's why the Quran is full of stories. Stories hold power. They are like a Trojan horse, the Greek story of the Trojan horse, and all the soldiers got into Troy hidden in a horse. So they let the horse through, then you open up the horse, and then all the soldiers come out. That's what story is. Story is a Trojan horse, because inside there are really powerful messages. But we wouldn't have accepted those messages if they'd been delivered as pieces of factual information with dates and locations and all the rest of it. But if we tell a story, it will land. It will land with us. And that part of the brain that processes story has not changed for millions of years since that caveman day. And we're all sitting here ready. We're wired for storytelling. That's basically it.
And that's why I think even things like studying for exams is so much more difficult than just reading something and then reproducing it. So I guess that's why even now education they're trying to break it down into pictures and stories just to help people remember. And how is that sort of when something happens to somebody, something traumatic when they're young, how does it become their narrative? Because I know you explained it, that the brain just remembers something. You can't tell the difference between, let's say we read a headline in the newspaper. We just believe that line And then later on, somebody tries to correct it and say, actually, it didn't happen that way. It's been exaggerated. But by then, all that is rubbish because our brain has taken that first big story or glamour or lie in, and then it's now actually refusing to accept what is the truth or what is the data. So how does that transcend in somebody who's maybe suffered something traumatic and it's remained with them?
So it's a really good question, because if we think about a small child who, perhaps everything's been going marvelously, we've got a great mum and we've got a great dad and we've got a great set of siblings, and then one day mum's taken to hospital because she's got cancer, or one day we're on our way to school and we get beaten to a pulp by some bullies down the road, and suddenly this life of Eden for the child is turned completely upside down, and what the child thought was true is no longer true. What the child thought was certain and predictable and absolutely going to happen, it doesn't happen like that at all. So the child then, thinking about that memory gets stored in the emotional part of our brain, in the story part of our brain, as a template for how the world is. So that part of the brain believes that is how the world is, and that part of the brain is going to hold on to that memory so that the next time you go to school and there's some bullies along the road, we can run, or we can take our big brothers and take some bats and fight. We're either fight or flight. So this part of the brain that doesn't listen to context, it's almost like a pattern matcher. It takes in, if you think of all the light that goes into our eyes and the noises that go into our ears and the smells that go into our nose, the taste of food that goes into our mouth, the touch of things, all of that, we call that sensory data. That sensory data is processed by that emotional brain as like a pattern matcher. So anything that looks remotely like what happened before, if there's a match, the brain says, the alarm goes, the adrenaline floods, and we either run or we fight, or we run or we fight. Now, for a small child, that is that child's reality. The child doesn't have any more information. A 7 or 8 year old only knows what its experience has provided for them. And so their tolerance, their emotional arousal levels are reset at that point. And they don't get reset unless there's an intervention. So that child will then grow up more anxious than it was before the bullying, or before mum went into hospital, or before the house burnt down. That child's anxiety levels and adrenaline levels are quite high, and now will be on guard looking for similar threats that threaten him, and will protect himself and try and control the world so that where there is a threat, that they can avoid that threat. And so people with this often become very controlling of their own world and controlling of the people in the world, because unconsciously they're dealing with quite a lot of threat that's coming at them through their eyes, nose, mouth. All of that pattern matching is going on an ongoing rolling basis. And those people become controlling, or they become very fearful and very anxious, one or the other. But they're both the same sides of the same. They're different sides of the same coin, really. It's response to threat.
Okay, so for that child who let's use that one, that mom went into hospital, became ill. Maybe mom didn't make it, didn't respond to treatment, and she dies. So as an adult, the minute they hear somebody's in hospital, or somebody's gotten an illness, all the stuff that they felt as a child comes, and their belief of the narrative is that person isn't going to make it, or they're really going to panic once they hear somebody's gone into hospital, or somebody's been diagnosed with cancer. So immediately they go into that, they sort of play back that narrative that happened to them when there was a child, that this is what happens when somebody goes into hospital. They get diagnosed with a particular illness. They don't actually come out, they die. So all the emotions they felt as a child, which wasn't managed or dealt with, all come back. And sometimes
can be
it's multiplied
triggered
now. Yeah, it can be a trigger, and it's multiplied now because life actually happens as well. and we absorb quite a lot of what's going on in the world, and we have it all inside. I'm sort of saying it quite simply so that people can recognize
Yeah,
some of these
yeah.
things, in them, so that we know when we are actually unduly anxious. It's not about the present. We might be reacting to a history, to something in the history that has triggered because something now happened.
So
Mhm.
so bringing that back to the power, then, if we're really anxious, which means that we're fearful. If we're anxious, we're fearful. If we're fearful, we're feeling powerless, i.e., we are feeling subject to the people, circumstances, and events that are around us, that are upon us. And so we are, like a child, fearful of what's going to happen, fearful and uncertain. Now, if internally we're feeling fearful about that things are going to go wrong, we have this option of coming out into the world, and certain people, and especially, I don't mean to be sexist, but culturally, men are more likely to come out with if they're internally fearful, to be controlling. Oh no, I've got this. I'm in charge. I know what I'm doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. Because this sense of having control, this sense of being in charge, this sense of deciding what will and what won't happen, gives a sense of security. It gives a sense of security where internally there is no sense of security. So this is like a seesaw bobbing up and down. And that sense of power, when we come out into the world and we say, it's got to be like this, it's got to be like this, it's got to be like this, this power can produce anxiety in other people. So then we're in a loop, and actually nobody is living in the here and now going, you know what, I'm not really sure. I wonder if, let's be curious, let's ask a few people what their view is. So there is no attempt to cover up our insecurity. We can be comfortable in our own insecurity when we live in the here and now.
So let's talk about that a little bit so that people can use it as a tool, because that's what you're giving them, a tool. If I feel anxious, so I notice that actually I'm quite controlling when something is happening that I feel I can't manage. So I just go into control mode where everything must be done my way, and I'm not listening, or I'm saying this is the way it has to be done. So just explain a bit what the here and now is. I know you touched on it, but in a way that people can sort of pick it up, and because part of it is sort of getting people to learn how to manage some of these feelings they might have.
Yes, of course. So we talked about when something happens that is unpredictable and we didn't expect it, and it's uncertain, and it might be traumatic, and it might be an ongoing uncertainty, which creates a lot of adrenaline in the bloodstream. Our hearts are beating a little bit faster. Our hands might get sweaty. We might be having short breaths. We're tapping our feet. We just don't know what's going to happen. Our mind is all over the place. We're actually looking ahead. Parents do this a lot. Parents, and it's natural. Remember, we said that the human is a mammal. All mammals want to look after their children. Our brains have been our brains have evolved to take care of children. What do we do to take care of children? We're constantly looking ahead to make sure that all the things that we dread happen don't. So we lift the glass vase off the bottom shelf. We send the child to this school instead of to this school. And parents, they seduce themselves into believing that they can tell what the future is. Oh, no, this is going to happen. So, but actually, nobody knows what the future is. And if they did, they'd be very, very rich people. And that's where we come up. That's where we become a cropper, because the future that we were expecting to happen, when it doesn't happen, when something else happens, oh my goodness. And that's where we go. So that's when we go into overdrive. Right, okay, we've got to do this, we've got to do this. But actually, if we don't seduce ourselves into believing that the future is exactly how, the parent says, my universe is the universe. The parent says, I'm right even when I'm wrong. The parent says, I know what's going to happen. It's a very emotional state, because it's an emotional state based on a fear of something happening, something going wrong. But if we take a step back, and we call it 7-11 breathing, this is really, really useful. So we breathe in for 7 seconds, fill our trunk, and then out for 11 seconds. And it doesn't really matter the number of seconds. What's important is that the out breath is longer than the in breath, because that tells the brain that there isn't a lion at the cave door, that actually, yeah, something's happened that we weren't expecting, but we don't have to go into overdrive. If we breathe in for 7 and out for 11, it lets the brain open up the thinking, which is our outer brain, the thinking brain, so that it can look at the facts, it can look at the context, it can stand back and go, hang on a minute, maybe I got this wrong. Let me just let's ask my husband, I thought we were doing this, but actually it hasn't happened like that. Is there a better way? Because I thought this might be it, but it's not that. So by breathing in and having a long breath out, it takes the adrenaline down. So immediately the brain says, oh, there's no crisis. Oh, well, we'll stop flooding the brain and the body with adrenaline. We'll let the muscles relax a bit. We'll let the thinking brain have a good look at the horizon of the landscape and see what's really going on, rather than reimagining all of those things that happened before that scared the hell out of us. Let's actually stay in the now. Let's actually see what is really going on. And we can't see what's really going on until we turn the adrenaline tap off in our brain. And we can't turn the adrenaline tap off without breathing. So we must let the brain know that actually there's no lion. Yes, something's gone wrong. It's fine. It's not a lion. If I breathe, I can now just look at the actual facts of the situation. I can let people know that I might have got something wrong, but that's okay. We're all flawed. We're all works in progress. It doesn't matter getting things wrong, as long as that we can work together to get the best outcome that we can, given the resources that we've got in the space that we're in. And in that way, we're not having to wield power and make someone else feel powerless. We're not feeling powerless and having power wielded upon us. We're all cooperating with what we've actually got in the here and now. That's the best way of reducing residual adrenaline in the bloodstream and not being on guard all the time.
So that's a better way of taking control than trying to control from the outside. Control from the inside.
From the inside.
Yeah. So control.
That's a lovely way of putting it.
Yes. So it's a way of saying, if I breathe in, count to 10, let it go, I'm actually letting go of the tension and all the stress that I'm feeling. And then I can actually begin to think logically. And sometimes people don't have somebody next to them, a husband, a child, a friend, So for somebody who's alone and, they go into that kind of panicky mood, it would be the same, just to breathe, calm down, and think of somebody you can reach out to. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yes. And there's something else that we can do. So I think everybody will recognize that voice in the back of their head that says, oh my God, what are you doing now? Oh, you shouldn't be doing this, and you shouldn't be doing that, and you should have done this, and you should have done that. What's going to happen if you don't do this? That voice and it's like your own mother's voice, or it's your grandparents' voice, or it's your teacher's voice, or it is in fact an amalgamation of all of the powerful voices that we were subject to when we were children. It sort of sits in a little tape recorder. It's not really a tape recorder, but it's like a tape recorder of all of that power in the back of our heads, so that when we're trying to think about what to do, this voice is saying, come on, you could do better than that. Have you seen the mess that you've made of that? We're shouting at ourselves. We're telling ourselves off. Or that voice is also saying, if you don't do that, this will happen. If you don't do that, that will happen. If you don't do that, people are going to laugh at you, or you're going to be ashamed of yourself. So that voice, well, who's that voice talking to? We call that the inner parent. That voice is talking to the inner child. So then our inner child is going, oh my God, what's going to happen? Oh my God, what's going to happen? So this voice is telling stories. Well, these stories are no more real than the stories from Hollywood. We're making them up. They're in our head. They're not real. They're just in our head. And so that's also upping the ante, upping the amount of adrenaline that's in our system. Now, there's another voice. There's another kind of parent who is much more useful to us, and we call that our nurturing parent. And we have an inner nurturing parent, and this voice doesn't get looking from a lot of us. And actually, this voice needs to be given much more volume, much more volume. And this is the voice that says, do you know what, Joanna? Yeah, you mucked up a bit there, but that's okay. Let's see what we can learn from it, and it will be fine, and we'll try again tomorrow. Or this voice will say, well, you're giving yourself a lot of scare stories about what might happen tomorrow, but nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. Why don't you just sit down, have a cup of tea, and watch a bit of television, and be thankful that you've actually got a television and a cup of tea to sit down to. So that's nice. Just relax. Just so it's a much more nurturing voice. So if we're on our own, we need to actually bring that voice of the nurturing parent in our head much more to the fore. And it's not nurturing just to be kind to ourselves. It's nurturing because we want to reduce the amount of adrenaline in our bloodstream that is making us anxious. So it's like, well, actually, I've got a choice here. I can either shout at myself and scare myself to death with all the stories I'm telling myself. Meanwhile, the world carries on as it is. Or I can be kind to myself and say, well, you know what? We've done today. We've done as much as we can. We've been as good as we can be. Let's just sit down and relax. And again, the world doesn't change whether you shout at yourself or whether you're kind to yourself. So you might as well be kind to yourself.
So that's one lesson, to be kind to yourself. You said something that I really find fascinating, that parents seduce themselves into thinking that they know the future, which is true, because parents would plan. Sometimes children are born and parents have this huge plan from nursery all the way, to university, careers, life partners, even whether they're going to be gay, they're going to be straight, they're going to have long hair, short hair, the kind of organizations they think that their children should be working in, the kind of careers, the kind of money that they earn. So even now, when you meet young parents, they're saying, oh, we have a schedule, we have to run to the schedule, they have to eat at this time, they have to sleep at this time. So it's all in this bit where parents actually feel like they know what's going to happen tomorrow or in 6 months' time. And when the child sort of gets to GCSEs and says, you know what, I'm not going to university, I'm going to do an apprenticeship, the parent just is about to have a meltdown, because this is not part of the plan. So I know we've sort of touched on, obviously, that nurturing and the critical parent. So we know children need boundaries, they need containment, and actually parents do stress a lot about these things, even though we're saying them quite jokingly. We know it's important for your child to be, for you to be nurtured properly, or taught good manners, and for them to go to school up to a certain level. So it's not that we're saying those things are not good, but how does a parent sort of not get drawn into this seduction of control and having a pattern that they wish them and their child have to stick to?
So if we think, because that style of parenting is usually given to us by our own parents, so it feels safe, it feels like that's what I got, so you can have some too. And of course, times change. The year 2021 is very different to the year 1961 and even 1981. And we have to, as humans, operate in a more responsive way to the current circumstances of the day. When we start refilling our heads with the stuff that we got filled with by our own parents, we are not looking at all the options. It's not an intelligent way forward. So if we're being emotionally intelligent, we are able to stand back and say, maybe there's a different way. Maybe what I'm seeing isn't all there is. Maybe there is more to see. Maybe there are more options. Let me be curious about what else is going on out there. And with that curiosity comes growth, comes development, comes innovation, comes passion. But if we are just refilling our children's heads with what we've been given, and we have this very narrow, blinkered, a child can only do two things. They can comply, and they may comply on the surface, but internally they're rebelling, or they'll rebel. neither of those are actual resonant engagement with the project, resonant engagement and agreement with the way forward, which means that there's no authenticity. If we haven't got that resonant engagement and acceptance of a way forward that we're all agreed on, then someone's being inauthentic. And if someone's being inauthentic, then we're not going to get a great outcome, because it's not a true path.
Okay. So parents, I think even parents that their children are grown up and they're trying to actually fit them back into a box that the children have somehow come out of, that's good advice. And for parents who are still nurturing and still have young children, that's great advice. So let's sort of turn now to the workplace. Okay. When we talk about discrimination in organizations, before we move into another side, what does it entail? Is it more educated staff versus uneducated? Is it male versus female?
Can be.
So how does that, so talk about that and how it impacts mentally, how it impacts the employee, the power dynamics in that.
So if we look at organizations, especially traditional organizations with traditional hierarchical structures, which invariably have a lot of white men at the top, and then everybody else underneath. The people at the top of an organizational structure are invested in their position. They are invested in their position, and so they will defend and protect their position. If somebody's protecting their position, then they are setting themselves up for somebody who might object to that position, who is in opposition to that position. So neither of these are actual. None of them are coming from a reality platform. They're coming from defensive. It's attack and defense. So discrimination actually works by unconscious protection of one's position. It's an unconscious. So there's very little outward racism and sexism going on in businesses today, not in professional businesses, not intentional, open, other, intentional. It's happening beneath the surface. And it's happening beneath the surface where recruitment practices are more likely to favour men than women. Oh, you're going to have to come in 24/7. You're going to have to work nights. Well, if you're a mother with children, that's not going to fit. So rules can work against. If we look at racial discrimination in organisations, there are. This is probably the most important thing. The people that are in senior positions in organisations, they socialise with other people in senior positions in the organisation. They all live in the same houses, or go to the same golf clubs, or they all have the same pastimes and cultural assets that they can all have a sense of belonging to. So when somebody that comes from a different culture comes along, they're not sharing a sense of belonging with those same cultural artifacts. So therefore the majority culture, which in the UK is the white culture, becomes the cultural parent of that organisation, and everybody else is in subservience to it. And it's very hard to win favour and to persuade somebody to invite you into their little group if that person feels that their own position is threatened by you, or that they don't understand it. Remember, the human brain doesn't like uncertainty, doesn't like unpredictability, doesn't like change. So to invite somebody into your inner group that you don't know what kind of school they went to, you don't know what their culture is like, you don't know what their religion's talking about, they'd rather not. So they'd rather not. It's like, well, actually, I've got a choice here between Michael, who went to the school down the road from me, or Benjo here, who went to a school in Tanzania. Well, actually, I'm going to go with Michael because he feels like a safer pair of hands to me. And that's how cultural hierarchies are. Yeah, that's how cultural hierarchies are maintained, and everybody that's maintaining those cultural hierarchies will say, I'm not a racist, but actually the practice, the recruitment practices are supporting that cultural hierarchy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think you've frozen on me. There you are.
I'm here. Yeah, I froze for a bit, but I think I'm okay now. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, okay.
And the other thing as well that works against women, BAME, Black people in the workplace is storytelling. Yeah. So we're back to storytelling. Thinking about the people with the social power in organisation, the people with the best stories are the ones that win. The people with the best stories are the ones that win. And they're the ones that win the social power game. Now, most organizations have got, a COO, a CEO, they've got some finance leaders, they've got an SLT and an exec, and then they've got your middle managers, and then you've got everybody else. And everybody knows who's, and there's the greasy pole for us all to climb. But actually, you can have a marketing director who's decided that they're going to have this amazing initiative run right across the company. If Fred, who's a great storyteller, and he's got all his mates out in the smoking corner outside, says, do you know what, that marketing director, I saw her the other day down at so-and-so, absolute disaster. She's an utter joke. I wouldn't believe anything that she said. It doesn't matter how much money was spent on that marketing campaign. It's not going to land with Fred. And Fred's got, everybody loves Fred. So if Fred doesn't like her, no one's going to like her. So that's how social power Now, if you're not socially powerful, then you're not going to get ahead. You're not going to be the one that's chosen, to be the one that's selected. Your ideas are going to be discounted in favor of somebody who is socially powerful. And that's how story and power operate in the workplace. And it's not really talked about a lot, social power, but it's in fact, it defines what really goes on. Most people are more interested in their social power than they are in their actual power.
Actually, I think, sometimes we feel we don't understand actually the importance of social power. We just think, oh, it's just John who is friendly in the workplace, speaks to everybody. We don't understand actually the amount of influence that person carries just because they're more sociable. Yeah. Just because they can interact a little bit easier than, the next person. They say hi, they ask how that person is. We forget that actually
they tell good stories. They tell good stories.
Yes. And they make
gossip, rumor.
Yes, and they're able to spread stories quite easily because everybody's opened and they've got an ear just to hear what that person has to say.
Yeah.
So that's the way that we divide. So people who are similar are in this group, and people who are not similar, talking about people who get invited to the golfing club, people who get invited to going around to the pub or to even their homes, versus the other person who going to the pub isn't part of their culture. They just do their work and go home. And it's because I guess for people who are living in a society where the dominant culture does all of these things, these are the norms, if we want a better word, the social norms. So does that, what you're saying, it means that people from a different culture will find it actually quite difficult to interact at work and move on?
Not to interact, but I don't think to interact, but they are in a much weaker and more vulnerable position in order to progress in that organisation. So let me tell you a story. I was teaching some students, and they were counselling psychotherapy students, and I was listening in on to one of their counselling sessions where they counsel each other to learn a skill. And I listened to this story of a woman who was talking about her father, a white man, who spent a lot of time in Nigeria on business and would invite Nigerians back to her house for dinner when they came to the UK. So he would host Nigerian businessmen at his dinner table, and when they had gone, would say to her, "I don't want you to bring a Nigerian home as a husband. That's not what I want for you." So what does that tell you? And I listened into that. That's a contemporary story. So we know that if that's what's going on in the household, what's going on in the boardroom? And until we get Black people in the boardroom, we're not going to get change.
And you know, sometimes you would hear a remark like, I don't like Black people, but you're different.
Yeah.
You know, those kind of remarks. So it is quite difficult, you know, when all these kind of odds are stacked against us. So how do we maneuver? How does your work help us and help the organization get away from these kind of stereotypical behaviors? How do we challenge the workplace?
So the work that I do is I go into organizations and I conduct what I call a cultural audit, and I find out all of the positions that people are holding, psychological safety positions that people are holding, which create them and us camps, which might be men, women, it might be clinicians versus non-clinicians, it might be operational staff versus back office staff, or you always get these them and us camps in the workplace. And then from them, then we work out, okay, what values of the organization are being taken seriously and what are completely being ignored. And from there, we say, okay, what is the shared story that everybody can be involved in? And it's a matter of taking it right back to basics and calling the game out. So it's like, okay, you're not having, so John can't move into operations because you say this, but in fact that's not borne out because these people have gone into operations. So why? And it's, well, actually, I don't know, John. I don't know. It's not a safe pair of. So we look at where is people's psychological safety being? Where do they feel safe, and why do they feel safe? And remember, going back to what we said about parents, how can we encourage senior managers to be curious rather than scared about things that they don't know? How can we encourage people to be more curious and exploratory and collaborative in the space of don't know, rather than an immediate, almost it's a reaction rather than a response to go, no, I can only deal with this, so it's going to be this way. It's got to be this way. It's exactly the same story that we talked about with parenting as it is, because the senior leadership in organizations are organizational parents, and they behave like parents. They think they know everything. Well, they don't.
Okay, so it's what you do is to challenge. What can, say, I do, you know, in my own little way? We're not saying people should take on, you know, the whole organization and begin to bulldoze, but in my own little way, how can I contribute to this change? Whether it's discrimination, whether it's racism in the workplace.
A good way, so first and foremost, is to be psychologically safe in your own skin. And by being psychologically safe, we are able to accept that we're not perfect, that we can make mistakes, that we don't know everything, and that we can be curious about the areas of life that we feel least comfortable in, or that we have least prediction or certainty over, and that's okay, and that's a solid place to start, because it reflects our reality. Nobody knows the future. Nobody knows what's going to happen, and we're all flawed. We've all got stories that mean that we only see a certain slice of reality, whereas somebody else sees another slice of reality, and that's okay. So then when we meet with somebody and we suspect or feel that actually there's a bit of unfairness going on here, or a bit of injustice, rather than us judging that person because they too are only seeing their own slice of reality and might be quite unaware of their discriminatory behaviour, we can be curious with that person. We can be genuinely curious rather than sarcastically curious. We can say, do you know what? It feels like this for me. And I don't know whether you're aware, but I thought that this was the fact and this was the fact. Can we sit down and discuss, is that the fact or is that not the fact? And why is there a different way of doing this so that it doesn't feel how it's feeling at the moment? So we are inviting another person to be curious with us rather than judging the other person. And when we invite somebody to be curious with us, the game's up, because they have to then actually address what is actual. They have to address what is factual. They have to address what is readily apparent and visible. It can't be denied or discounted anymore. But this is very careful work, because we have to be genuinely curious, remembering that a lot of these people who are in a discriminatory state of mind are doing so out of fear for their own uncertainties, for their own, because they don't know how else to be. So by inviting them curious about that takes us a step forward. Whereas if we're judgmental about it, the guards go up and there's no dialogue.
Okay, great. So it's actually looking at them with empathy rather than judging, because that leaves the door open for us to interact and bring change. Okay.
Yeah.
We've come to time. Well, I've learned a lot. I'm sure people listening have learned a lot today. Do you have anything you want to leave us with before we close?
Oh no, I don't think I do. I've had a marvelous time. It's been really interesting, and it's really, I think it is really interesting when you join all the, because we're all just human, aren't we? We're all human, and we're all doing the best we can, and that's all we can do. And tomorrow is another day.
All right. Thank you, Joanna.
That's right.
Please tell us where we can find you. Just your website.
Yeah. So my website is I don't know. I can't say it because it will just sound.
Okay, so if anybody wants to contact Joanna, they can contact me, and I'll put them in touch with you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your knowledge, your wisdom, and continue to soar. Thank you.
Lovely to see you. Bye.
Thank you. Good to see you. See you again soon, I'm sure.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. What a wonderful evening we've had. We've talked about controlling adrenaline, controlling what's going on inside you and leaving that out. How parents get seduced into thinking they know the future. How to pick the nurturing parent, not the critical one. And most, I think, how do we deal with discrimination or racism in workplaces? Thank you for watching and listening. My name is Lydia Khalil, and I will see you next week.
LCBN television broadcasts 24/7 on UK Freeview Channel 271, Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, Android TV, Apple TV, Google TV, See Love World, LCBNTV.com, LifeComTV.com.